ending. Ever seen one of those M. Night Shyamalan movies like The Sixth Sense or Signs or The Village? Every one of those movies has a twist at the end. The suspense is built up throughout the movie because there's a struggle going on, and you're never sure how it's going to end. But then there is that moment in the movie when the truth is revealed and you gasp because it was right there in front of you all along. You just didn't see it. I love a surprise ending. The River has a surprise ending. We've come to the end of our sermon series on rivers in the Bible. We started with the Nile. The river flowing through the Sea of Reeds came next. Then we went to the Jordan. And we've learned a lot about what rivers symbolize in the Bible. Last week we didn't have a river when we began. Remember, we were in the midst of exile with Ezekiel, and we wondered where the river was in the midst of our ecological crisis. But then we saw Ezekiel's vision of the river flowing down through the temple and the balcony steps, and we learned that God's river can bring new life. Today we have one more thing to learn about the river. The river has a surprise ending. Once again, there's no river to begin with. We're in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. It was written by a man named John who lived on the island of Patmos in the Mediterranean Sea sometime between the years 60 and 100. So this is long after Christ was crucified and resurrected. Much has been written about the bizarre symbolism in this book. And some Christians want to see hidden codes to try to determine the end of the world, when that's going to happen. But scholars have discovered that this book had a specific history written for it, because the Christians at that time were facing persecution by the Roman Empire. So just as the Israelites found themselves in exile in the land of Babylon, so the people of the church were in exile, their land, in a sense, scorched by the Romans, just like the Israelites were. Now, this book has relevance for our modern world, but not in some cryptic way that we're trying to foretell the future. It has a specific purpose of critiquing our current social structures that persecute and dominate people. Revelation portrays this as a life and death struggle between the forces of God and Satan. And for people like you and me, when we're caught in the midst of those struggles, it can feel overwhelming. You just read the newspaper and you can feel that struggle that goes on in the world. There are powerful forces at work, and for a small person, it's really hard to feel like you have any power in the midst of that. Every one of us has experienced some kind of struggle in one way or another. Where do you feel caught between powerful forces? Maybe for you it's about some international issue like a war overseas. Or maybe it's a national struggle like the one on healthcare or public education. Or maybe your struggle hits closer to home. You're trying to figure out how to deal with aging parents. Or you're in a workplace where they put more and more demands on you and give you less and less. Or maybe you're a young person and you're getting ready to go back to school in a couple weeks. And you know all of those forces are going to be pulling at you when you go back to school. Your schoolwork, sports teams, your friends, your church, everything pulling at you, and you're trying to figure out how to balance in the midst of all that. Or maybe you're caught between two parents who each want you to do two different things. And that can be a struggle as well. See, the struggles are everywhere. And we find ourselves caught in these larger-than-life situations, and we don't always always know how we're going to make it through. We don't know how the story's going to end for us. And I want you to take a moment and think about that struggle that you're dealing with in your life, or that you've dealt with in your life. And I want you to imagine that when you're looking at that struggle, that it looks something like a war zone, when there's two sides that are fighting each other. And the ground is scorched and smoking, and everything looks black and gray because it's been charred by this terrible battle. The smell of burning things makes you cover your nose. And inside you feel as bleak as the landscape in front of you. But suddenly you hear water behind you, and someone calls your name. You turn around and you see an angel. And this angel is pointing to a river flowing right by your feet. Your eyes follow the river upstream, and you see the most beautiful, spectacular sight you've ever envisioned. It is the throne of God that John of Patmos saw. It is huge, taller than any building you've ever seen, and it's covered in every jewel the color of the rainbow, but it's transparent, so the light shines through it. And its light comes on you like a rainbow and floods the entire landscape. The water from that river is flowing directly from that throne, and it's cascading down in a magnificent waterfall. With your eyes, you follow the water downstream, and you expect to see that bleak and charred landscape that you were just looking at, but instead, it's been transformed. There's grass now growing on all sides. All of those charred pieces have been absorbed into the earth, and wildflowers are there in their place. And everything around you has a feeling of peace, and you feel that peace inside you that reflects the landscape in front of you. And then you recognize right next to you is the tree of life, just like you read about. You're standing right next to it, and you notice that there's not just one kind of fruit, but there's 12 kinds of fruit on this tree. And you see the leaves, and you reach up and you touch one, and you're just flooded with a feeling of hope and well-being. And you realize that the leaves of this tree were meant for every problem that was part of this charred landscape. And you hear the voice saying, the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Your mind thinks of all of those struggles on the international, on the national, on the personal level, and you realize that these leaves are meant for our world and your life. And then you see that there's not just one tree, but there's another, and there's another, and another, and another, and another. And it just goes on and on. All of these trees, hundreds, thousands of trees lining this beautiful river, going on as far as the eye can see. And a light radiates from the throne of God and infuses everything. And you hear the voice of God, and the voice of God says, "See, I am coming soon. Let everyone who thirsts come. Let anyone who wishes to take the water as a gift come. Surely I am coming soon." And then you gaze upon the throne, and you look through the jewels, through the glass, to the center of the throne, and you gasp, because right at the center of the throne is the cross. It was there all along, but you didn't notice it at first. And then you see that the river is coming directly from the cross. And it is flowing all the way down, flowing out into our world, cascading out into the charred landscape, transforming everything around it. And you think back to the time when Jesus was on the cross, and you remember the time when the soldier took his spear and he pierced Jesus' side. And what flowed from the side of Jesus? Who remembers what flowed from Jesus' side when they pierced his side? Blood and water. Communion and baptism. That is what comes from the heart of God, from the very center of God. This was not what we expected from the cross. John tells us that it is the Lamb of God who is at the center of it all. The Lamb meaning Jesus, the crucified one. You see, Jesus was caught in those same struggles that we are, that you're caught in. It was a life and death struggle between forces that seemed bigger than him. And that struggle pulled at him and pounded his flesh into that tree and tore at him and pushed the air from his lungs and seemed to swallow him up in death's grip. That cross is a symbol for everything that's wrong with our world. All the sin and violence, the corruption, the war, hunger, inequality, racism, classism, sexism, it's all there. But you see, God takes that symbol of death and pulls it inside out so that it becomes transformed into something that is life-giving. If you want to see the throne of God, you only have to look here. Because the cross is the throne of God. The writer of John's Gospel remembered that story of Jesus, the water and the blood flowing from his side. And he wanted to show us that the river has a surprise ending, or rather, a surprise beginning. Because as that water flows, we realize that the source is Jesus Christ himself on that cross. And if you want to see one of those trees of life for the healing of the nations, look at the person next to you. Look at them. You're the trees of life. You are the ones planted by the waters. We are the ones, you and me, we have the fruits that the world needs. We are the leaves for the healing of the nations. The world looks to us because we are firmly planted by those waters. And what we do and what we say and our actions out in the world are meant for the healing of the world. It's you and me and Christians around the world and churches and organizations, everyone who works for God's purposes. We are the ones who bear that fruit. We are the trees. Just like the kids were doing up here, we are balanced and firmly rooted in God's word. So when you are in the midst of a struggle, when you find yourself caught between forces that are bigger than you and pulling at you, you just need to come on down to the river. You are one of those trees gathered at the river that absorb the crystal clear waters, and they will never fail you. They will never grow stagnant. They will never go dry. That river flows from the throne of God, from the cross of Jesus, and it sustains us, nourishes us in our parched inside. We are nourished by those life-giving waters of the cross. When you're feeling down, come on down to the river. If you know someone who is struggling, invite them to come down to the river. when you're needing to get in touch with the true power of God, when you want to experience the presence of God, come on down to the river. This is the divine paradox of what it means to be a Lutheran. That in the midst of your struggle, that's where God is. Where you're at your weakest, God is at the strongest. That's what these sermons have all been about. People gathering at the river, God's river, to have their lives transformed, to watch the power of God shaping human history, to be able to affect human events. Shall we gather at the river? That's what we're going to be singing. Yes, we'll gather at the river. Shall we gather at the river? Yes, we'll gather at the river. We'll gather with Pharaoh's daughter and Moses' mother to see that the river can bring out the best in people. Shall we gather at the river? Say with me. Yes, we'll gather at the river. We'll gather at the river with the Israelites to watch God part those waters when we're faced with those terrible trials, and we'll know that sometimes the river can make you believe in God. Shall we gather at the river? Yes, we'll gather at the river. We'll gather at the river Jordan when the Israelites are ready to go into the promised land, knowing that God goes before them, knowing that the river can bring you back to God. Shall we gather at the river? Yes, we'll gather at the river. We gather with Ezekiel and the Israelites in the midst of exile, knowing that God's river can bring new life. Stand up now. Shall we gather at the river? Yes, we'll gather at the river. Right here at the cross, that river flows through all of us, through you and you, all of you who are the trees that are for the healing of the nations. You are firmly planted, and you are absorbing that river of God. Shall we gather at the river? Yes, we'll gather at the river. The beautiful river that flows by the throne of God. Let us sing number 423 in our red hymnal. Shall we gather at the river?